All right, so we're going to do timeline number 15. This is Cold War. If you look at the two timelines we're going to do today, Cold War, this one is pretty well jam-packed. The second one is significantly shorter, okay? So for the Cold War, we're going to do one is just the Cold War. Now we're going to start this timeline in 1940, but what's the important note to know? We already know 1945 is the end of World War II. Have that somewhere in your head. At the end of this timeline, we're going to have the year 2000. The timing that's in your head is about 1990. About 1990 is the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall falls in 88 or 89. The actual Soviet Union breaks up in 91 or 92. Just remember 1990, you're good. Up at the very top, just underneath that box, give me one little thing that spans the whole Cold War and called it, I don't know, let's say the Cold War. Now, the point of the Cold War is essentially that it is the West, remember this is European history, versus the East. The other names for Eastern Europe at this time, the most important one is that Eastern Europe all lies behind the Iron Curtain. It also can be called the Soviet bloc or the Eastern bloc. That always refers to the Eastern European countries that are technically their own countries like Poland, but in reality are controlled by the Soviets and the Soviet Party. So in these, for the West, what is the name of the military group that runs the West? NATO. The military alliance is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, obviously headed by America, but for European history, includes West Germany, France, England, and all of Western Europe. Now, NATO, besides the military pact, the other thing America headlines, but most of Western Europe does, is they all pay into programs that are designed to help the smaller countries. Why do we want to financially help smaller countries during the Cold War? Yes? No, explain it in one word. You should have it up. You put it in a box up top. The whole of the Cold War is about what? Containment. Good. Half a gold star. It's about containment, all right? We want to make sure the smaller, less developed countries that develop, they get money, they join the capitalist side, all right? We'll mention Marshall Plan in a minute, but the groups up here, we create the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and a bank that any country in the world is allowed to draw from called the World Bank. Containment. It's the last two timelines. I've given up on it. So the IMF and the World Bank are both about essentially getting money into the developing nations. So places like India will borrow money to build their electric infrastructure and then eventually built like internet, and bam, they've joined the modern world. The other one that managed world trade was called the World Trade Organization. Thank you. On the other side, in the Eastern Bloc, the way the Soviets controlled the non-Soviet Union countries first off, sorry. What's the military group for the Eastern? It's the Warsaw Pact. The way they controlled them is Comecon. It's an acronym. You don't need to know the real term because it's in Russian, but Comecon. Now, the way Comecon spread communism, they won't use the term communism. If you're reading Soviet bloc stuff, they won't use the term communism. They'll use either a command economy or the more famous word, they'll say central planning. Central planning, if you see that term in this context, it just means communist. It means the government controls the economy, socials, military, everything else. And the ultimate point of this, the selling point for communism, is that they will focus on social welfare. Right? The selling point for communism at this time is that they are going to make sure even the poorest of the poor people, even the people that will just work in the countryside on farms, will have the basic necessities, will have food, clothing, and shelter. They'll argue that capitalism as a system doesn't protect those people. Those people will simply starve and die because they don't provide enough value, and that's not how capitalism works. Next color. Let's do economy. We're mostly talking about Western Europe here. In fact, we're basically only talking about it. Give me a little column right here. This is the most we're going to write under for economy. The number one thing that helps boost the economy of Western Europe after World War II. Western Europe is really, really well destroyed. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of infrastructure. So America devises the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan gave billions and billions of dollars to Western Europe. And the way the Marshall Plan comes up most of the time is, does it work? Yes. Western Europe gets back on its feet faster than even the most optimistic people expected. They will use the term economic miracle. The economic miracle of Western Europe after World War II. Now, one of the things that the Western Europe will focus on, right, is when you have an entire country full of millions of orphans, millions of widows, that's women with children that have to support their own family, which at this time is really difficult to do on their salary, and you have a lot of homeless, your government is going to focus a lot more on social welfare. You're going to create programs for orphans and widows and everything. The term they'll use here, especially for Great Britain, is it becomes a welfare state. Which you know and you recognize in this class. Don't draw the political spectrum up here. That's just for me. But the social welfare state on the political spectrum is going to be where? It's going to be right here, okay? Which tells you what's going to happen eventually. After the 1670s, it's going to swingy backy. What is it called over here? Neoliberalism, right? It swings back to neoliberalism. What's the buzzwords for neoliberalism? The government is not the solution to the problem. The government is the problem. So what do we need to do with all the things the government runs? Privatization. Good. Who's the poster child for this? Thatcher for this class, but if you're thinking of Reagan, you're in the right realm. They're the same person as far as this class is concerned, okay? So what's the problem with focusing on social welfare and a welfare state? Like, what's the argument against it? What's the downside of this? Yeah, higher taxes, a lot of money. They'll say budget. Budget with a frowny face. Higher taxes, a lot more government spending to manage these programs. All right. So as far as the economy, the whole economy is moving towards this ultimate industrialized economy, which is all about making things, which means it's a consumer economy. Right, the generation, we're going to talk about the baby boomers in a second, right? The generation after World War II, they grow up in this consumer economy that's all about mass production and whatnot. And they own a lot of stuff, right? Hoarding isn't a problem before 1950s, but there's a problem today because they're all old and won't get rid of anything, right? So we have mass production. Now, when you think about this era in the 1950s, I always want you to picture the American suburbs, right? A nice house in the suburbs, white picket fence. The domestic women, we'll talk about women in a second, but what helps her out at home? It's domestic goods. We start to see a lot of these goods that do improve the quality of life of many people, right? But in the separate spheres where men play one role in society, women play another role in society, it benefits women more. The actual invention, or not inventions, but on a wide scale, we see electricity and plastics, obviously. When all the soldiers come back from war, we suddenly, about 9 months later, have a big baby boom. Baby boom because of economic progress and economic stability and stuff like that. People have more money, they have more kids, all right? Why don't people have kids today? It's expensive. Kids are disgusting, that's fair too, and inherently useless, but they are incredibly expensive, all right? Now, the thing for the baby boomers here is that when they're all kids, if a society as a whole has a lot more kids, what does it do? There's more government policies focused on helping these kids. Examples would be education, or they will say childcare. If they focus on childcare for all these, again, that's because we have a whole lot more kids, so that's a focus. We have less kids now, so there's less focus on education and things like childcare, and now we have a lot of money going to retirement homes. Social Security is not going to change while they're still alive because there's a lot of them and they vote and they benefit from it. All right. Next up. This is the Cold War outside of Europe. There's only a couple things to write down here. Give me the next column right here. Cold War outside of Europe. Again, as an AP European history class, there's not a lot on here, but we should mention the major conflicts of the Cold War. In the 1950s, what was the big battleground regarding containment? Korea. Write this real small. I need this whole middle ground up here. And then in the 1970s, write these small because we're going to write three of them. What are the big battlegrounds? Vietnam. That's the obvious one, but the other two they might ask about. There's a war around Israel, right, where America supports Israel, the Soviet Union supports the surrounding states. It's called the Yom Kippur War. And the Soviets also invaded another sovereign state, Afghanistan. We sent a whole lot of money and arms to Afghanistan to try and help them push back the Soviets. Other buzzwords in here, propaganda and covert ops. Never really talked about it, but it's obviously a big part of the Cold War. The other part of the Cold War outside Europe is a continuation of basically imperialism. We talked about World War I being the end of imperialism. After World War I, we see dozens and dozens of colonies earn their independence, most notably places like India. But after World War II, any of the remaining colonies will get more and more of their independence until none of them functionally remain. So colonial independence. The most famous one that formally gets its independence is India. Now, besides Mahatma Gandhi, what is the body that helps guide India towards a peaceful independence? It's called the Indian National Congress. The other two are a French colony. What's France's largest colony they hang on to the longest? Algeria. This is the Algeria National Liberation Front. And the last guy, you know his name, another former French colony, once called French Indochina, in Southeast Asia is Ho Chi Minh. And you know that's in Vietnam. He fights for his independence from France, gets it essentially, and then takes a lot of money from the Soviets and tries to spread communism, at which point America tries to contain it. Thank you. Stop it. Come on, grow up. Second to last one. Give me another color if you want. This is one of the big ones, women. So women for this era, this whole middle ground, you can give me from 1940, before the very beginning to the very end. So what are we going to care about? First off, women in World War II. Women in World War II. All right, when you think about women in World War II, who do you think about? Who do you think about? Rosie the Riveter. Thank you. So, women participate in the economy, military, and since they just earned the right to vote, women more and more start to participate in politics or government. After World War II, we have the 1950s, which is always, we think about white picket fence. The term here that we're going to see is the 1950s housewife. And we bring that term up again for two reasons. A, we're still in the old time of society where there are distinct gender roles, but the 1950s are where we start to see those roles blend. And as is tradition, it's not that great for women in that 1950s housewives, the primary goal is to raise and manage the family. But as women start to enter the workforce, it's not that they take on less family duties and take on more work duties. It's that they have the same amount of family duties, however, are starting to take on more work. So now women are playing two roles. They are becoming a money earner and yet are still expected to raise and develop and clean essentially the family. Over the next generations, we're going to see that change and become more of a balance, but that is what brings us into the big one, second wave feminism. If first wave feminism is about political equality, This is about economic and social equality. We're going to start seeing things like the gender wage gap, and then especially what do I have? Women more income. So the biggest piece of evidence that comes up here is going to be what? 1950s, the invention of the pill. Okay, invention of the pill. All right. What is the ultimate impact at a macro level on the pill on society for women? Is instead of working jobs where at some point they're going to have 2 or 3 kids at the minimum and be out of work for 3 or 4 years, now women have, what's the word? Can develop careers. By having more control over family planning, women have more of an opportunity and ability to develop and manage careers. And that is what continues to push along second wave feminism. Women start to become much more significant in the 80s and 90s, especially in politics. The best example of women in politics from the 1980s is going to be Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England, and they also earn more representation in legislative bodies. Last color. Something we're going to talk about on both timelines is ultimately what is Europe going to be called 100, 200 years from now? This is not true. I'm making this to make a point. It's going to be called the United States of Europe. Basically, after World War II, Europe starts to take a dozen different steps on becoming one unified country because, as you've learned in this class, small countries are weak and get taken over. And as we go through the Cold War with the United States as a superpower and the Soviet Union as a superpower, Europe gets left behind. Even today, the EU, which is the end of this journey, well, in many ways the end of this journey so far, is becoming more united as it's faced with China versus America versus a rising India. So what do they do? This is towards the EU, or towards its European unity, or just EU is fine. So the very first thing, very quickly after World War II, Europe realizes it needs to rebuild its country. What do you physically need to rebuild the country? Besides money. Which resources? So what they do is they create a council to help facilitate certain resources buying and it's called European Coal and Steel Community. European Coal and Steel Community, I believe headquartered in Luxembourg, helped trade these resources back and forth. The next step, the big one that helped them start trading more resources back and forth, is called the European Economic Community. But better known, Grant, put a star by it as Common Market. When you inevitably get your essay about European unity, Common Market is essentially going to be its paragraph about an easier exchange of goods and services between the countries. Eventually, we are going to create a European Union. We'll see more steps here in the next timeline, which is both economic and political identity. Both of these steps are about economic unions. We're eventually going to get into like the European Parliament, which is about political unions. Go ahead and erase that and start your next timeline.